this is Connected Capital, a video series in which we look to shine a spotlight on an area of sustainability. In each episode, I'm joined by an expert from the fields of science, industry, finance, philanthropy, or policy, in order to explore the connections with and between the natural capital and human capital worlds, and how better deployment of financial capital can help preserve, protect, and nurture our planet for those to come. Today, I'm joined by John Auckland, founder and CEO of Seafields. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the concept of this video series is to draw connections between different spheres and worlds, and to demonstrate the importance of seeing things as a whole, seeing things holistically, when we're looking for solutions for some of the biggest challenges that we face. And I think the business that you've founded and that you run really demonstrates the importance of that. You're CEO and co-founder of Seafields, a business that works almost entirely within the seaweed industry. And that really focuses on this idea of blue carbon, so carbon that's extracted from oceans. Can you just give us a definition and kick off by talking about blue carbon and its importance in tackling climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. So the oceans cover 70% of the planet's surface. And importantly, they're also some of the most unproductive parts of our planet. So if you think of the subtropical gyres, covers about 50% of the planet's surface, and most of them are pretty devoid of life. So there's a huge opportunity there to use both the underserved parts of the planet and also the diffuse nature of the ocean to store a lot of the carbon that we're currently emitting into the atmosphere, and historically as well, right? We've got gigatons and gigatons of anthropogenic legacy CO2 that we pumped up there, which according to the IPCC, we need to remove about 30% of that. And the ocean's already done most of the heavy lifting in drawing down about 90% of the heat, and annually draws down about 30% of human-made emissions. So it's already doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I think this sort of term of blue carbon is really about trying to give the oceans a helping hand and making it more productive, or at least giving it a fighting chance, but also trying to mitigate some of those negative effects that have happened to the oceans since they started drawing down a lot of that CO2.
And that brings me on to your business, Seaweed Farm. Unpack that for us. That's probably a pretty new concept for most people.
Yeah, so it's actually one of the oldest industries in the world. It's thousands of years old, but mainly growing seaweed for people to eat. So it's common in the Asian diet, but it's not very common in the Western diet. So the Western world is quite sort of waking up to seaweed, but it's go to Asia and it's common and it's all over the place. I think people are waking up to the seaweed carbon removal opportunity quite quickly, because if we think about solving the climate crisis, it's about growing a lot of biomass. Right, the amount of carbon we need to remove is equivalent to the amount of carbon that is currently stored in the biosphere, so in animal and human life. So we've got to double that somehow. How the hell are we going to do that? Right, and so trees is one way of doing it, but it will take 10 years for a lot of trees to reach full maturity, whereas seaweed can have incredibly fast growth rates. So sargassum, the seaweed we use, will double in size in 14 days. So just trapping the carbon via photosynthesis, which is nature's best tool for storing carbon, can happen much faster timescales by using seaweed.
So if you were to grow the seaweed in the zones of the sea that you've said have no life, there's enough nutrients for that seaweed to grow?
So no, and so what we need to then introduce is a new type of technology. There's enough nutrients trapped at about 400 meters down, and this is across the entire planet's surface. The ocean, the deep ocean around the entire planet. And essentially what happens is when the ice of the poles melts, it's cold, it then sinks to a certain level. That's very, very nutrient-rich water. And so that sinks down to quite a deep depth, to about 400 meters, and then spreads out across the entire oceans of the world. And so if you think about what might use those nutrients to create life, to photosynthesize our phytoplankton blooms, they can only exist in the top 80 meters, 90 meters of the water column, because that's how far the light's penetrating. So you've got this crazy situation where you've got more nutrients than, almost an infinite supply of nutrients trapped to 400 meters, nothing at the top.
And everything can access that.
So if we can access that, irrigate those nutrients to the surface, then all of a sudden you make these areas of the ocean, usable for aquaculture, which is really quite exciting.
But in the natural world, that nutrients can't be accessed at all without your technology.
No, they'll take thousands, if not tens of thousands of years to find their way back to the surface to be used by an ecosystem. There are natural upwelling regions, so there are some locations where those nutrients are being supplied, so off the west coast of Africa, for example. And that's why you're seeing this invasive seaweed bloom in Mexico and the Caribbean, because you've got some of these natural upwelling regions, but also human runoff, right? Yeah. With river deltas where industrialized farming is just creating all of these NPK fertilizers that we're using all over the land, ends up in the water system and then leaches into the ocean. And so you're getting these seaweed blooms anyway. And to make matters worse, as the planet warms, seaweed blooms increase in proliferation anyway, right? It's a natural response. So if we allow that to go unchecked and uncontrolled, all these small island developing nations that are already struggling from climate change now have an additional problem to deal with: invasive seaweed blooms, which are killing the tourism industry, killing their ecosystems. The fishermen can't even go out and fish. The stuff gets caught up in their propellers. So if we can find a way of leveraging nature's power to grow seaweed, but in places that doesn't impact on those ecosystems, but also where nature decides that it is going to create a seaweed bloom, also putting a price and a value on that seaweed so that it gets dealt with quickly, then you've got a really strong business model. You've got carbon removal that's happening by default, and you also have amazing co-benefits in being able to support local communities in being able to mitigate their invasive seaweed problems.
You can see some of these seaweed blooms from space, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so NASA's just recently sent up the PACE satellite, which will track the microalgae blooms, so the phytoplankton blooms. There are people that are, we use a satellite provider that looks at the invasive sargassum as a problem, and it can create pretty accurate, 1 meter resolution image of where the sargassum is on a kind of daily basis. So you can see these seaweed blooms. You can kind of also judge how big they are. And, this Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt has only been arriving in the Caribbean since about 2011. So for something that was never there before, previous largest seaweed bloom was about 27 million tons, which was in 2019. This year, or the year just gone, sorry, the bloom was as big as 60 million tons. It's doubled in size, more than doubled in size. So, this is how quickly this problem is kind of escalating. So there's a huge amount of biomass out there. It's, for the most part, a carbon sink, because most of that seaweed is sinking to deep waters. The challenge is when it's naturally, exactly. But it's the stuff that sinks above 500 meters, will rot on the beach, it will re-emit as methane, which is a more acute greenhouse gas than CO2. And so parts of it are kind of a runaway climate effect. So if we can concentrate all the sinking into really, really deep waters, over 4,000 meters, that will lock that carbon away for thousands and thousands of years.
So your business captures the seaweed, maybe it grows it on the farm, maybe it captures it, and then effectively sinks that carbon in the seaweed down into the deep ocean.
Yeah, so the business model is to catch invasive stuff, move it to a paddock. So we created these paddocks that we call algiponics. It's like a free-floating sargassum paddock, very, very minimal external infrastructure, but it has GPS tracking on it, has various sensors. We can check the health of the sargassum inside, and it allows us to control the growth and control the harvest. When we do harvest, we then separate out the liquid from the solid biomass. That preserves and stores the solid biomass. The liquid is quite valuable. That can be concentrated and then sold as a biostimulant to the agricultural industry. Most of the value comes from the liquid. The solid can be converted into various sort of valuable materials, or it can be sunk to the deep ocean for permanent carbon removal. About 30% of the biomass is embodied carbon. So it's quite a high concentration. And there's probably things we can do in the future to get that number even higher, right? And valorize more of the seaweed, but just sink the carbon. So that's our, and the more you do that as well, what's quite interesting is the more you take the valuable stuff out, the less likely it is to decompose in the deep ocean anyway. Yeah. So we're still perfecting that model, but ultimately, what you can view it as, there's two ways of viewing it. One way is viewing it as heavily subsidized carbon removal, where you're making most of your money from the products and the value you're extracting before you sink. The other way of looking at it is maximizing the durability and the permanence of the removal by disincentivizing decomposition by removing those micronutrients and all those other things.
And that's why it's so interesting to compare what you're doing with very basic logging. Because when you're cutting a tree down, you're just making it into the component parts. The value is just from that. There's nothing left over that you can still store carbon in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, woody biomass is a method that others are looking into, and there's definitely a place for it. But, to your point, you can't really valorize, unless you sell it either, for its kind of constituent parts to be turned into paper or furniture or whatever, or you sink it. You kind of can't double dip, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think this is the thing that I've struggled with carbon removal generally, is how do you find business models where you can make money and then the carbon removal either happens by default or happens with your quote unquote waste product, right? That's the thing I've been really, really interested in trying to find as a business model for me to get into the carbon removal space. I've been watching the space for a very long time. My background is not as a seaweed farmer. My background is more working with impact entrepreneurs to help them get their businesses off the ground and to get investment. And run accelerator programs for impact businesses, and I've run them for very well-known family offices. So I've been on the lookout for a business model that makes percentage point gains towards solving the climate crisis, and really struggled to find something that does that. And that's what attracted me to the idea behind Seafields is, this diverse revenue model, which it makes it attractive to investors, but the removal happens as a result of the core business activity. So we're not entirely reliant on the fluctuations of the carbon removal or carbon credit market to finance the activity. And that's the bit that makes me nervous. How are we going to scale the carbon markets from the couple of $1 billion size that they are now to the $1 trillion size they need to get to? And how many companies are going to voluntarily pay that sort of money to remove the amount of CO2 we need to remove? I don't see it happening. So we've got to get creative with business models and find ways of leveraging the power of the markets to kind of make both things happen at the same time. Investors make profit, carbon removal happen by default. Well,
that's the thing. I think what you're doing is trying to make it more palatable to a traditional financial industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I think the financial investors do need to make money. That's kind of a given. And I think what you also need to look at is existing supply chains. How can you leverage legacy infrastructure rather than going to someone and saying we need to build a load of new stuff from scratch, right? That's and how can you? The beauty of sargassum is that it's very minimal infrastructure. So in theory, it's got a kind of exponential cost curve rather than a linear one, which a lot of seaweeds require a lot of infrastructure because they don't free float their entire lives. Sargassum free floats its entire life, so it doesn't grow off ropes and lines and cages and all this really expensive infrastructure you need to build for it. So, and I think, what some of the other use cases beyond just carbon removal is oil and gas alternatives. So the really, really exciting one is naphtha. Now, naphtha is, it's one step down from crude oil in the kind of energy conversion of polymers. And so it's actually relatively convenient to turn sargassum into naphtha. And naphtha creates so many different products that we live with every day, such as high density plastics and UPVC and in some cases energies and certain diesels and so on and so forth, because it's a kind of kingpin feedstock, if you want to call it that. And yet you can extract that from sargassum with relative ease. So then you're saying to the oil and gas companies, you don't need to repurpose all your existing infrastructure. You can just take this different feedstock, which acts identical to the stuff that you're using from crude oil, and it's not that much more expensive. And there will be a tipping point where crude oil extraction probably does get more expensive and the cost comes down for growing seaweed. So, that's when the financial markets go, okay, right, great. So we can both transition away from oil and gas. We can make ESG investments, but it looks very similar to what we had before. And I think that's where we really start to, properly solve the climate crisis.
And could you extract the polymers from the sargassum and still sink? Or does it become an either or at that stage?
It becomes an either or. That being said, you do, because you have to use a pyrolysis sort of method, which is similar to how you create biochar. So you still end up with 25% of the embodied carbon comes back in a biochar. and you get, so there's a carbon removal that takes place whilst creating the polymers. So that's, again, really quite exciting.
Yeah. And how close is the oil and gas industry to seeing this as an alternative? Sorry, not the oil and gas industry, the aviation industry or the users of the oil and gas?
Well, no, I think across the spectrum, I think they're interested. I think they had their fingers burnt with microalgae. I think the energy output on microalgae wasn't, didn't live up to the hype. So they're cautious, and we're also very nervous of kind of overhyping it. But meaningful quantities have been created through this approach. What macroalgae or floating seaweed has as an advantage over microalgae is that because it free floats, because we can use all these open ocean spaces, you can get to a lot of biomass very quickly without impacting on other ecosystems, and the infrastructure costs are very low. So, and the energy output is on a par with microalgae. So we've got interest from large oil companies. We've also got a lot of interest from intermediaries, so the EPC type companies that serve the oil company that are looking for a life beyond oil and gas. And they're very, very interested. I mean, we're having conversations with, we're a tiny startup, having conversations with massive multinationals that are willing to give us a lot of their time and resource and, experts and even design time in some cases to help us develop solutions, because they are so invested in trying to find what comes after oil and gas. And, we have also potential investors that are large oil companies that are looking, and there's a lot of accusation with big oil companies that they're looking at this space for greenwashing purposes. I'm going to debunk that right now. They're looking for what's going to make them the most money. So they're looking because they think it's going to make good money, not because they can see it as a get out of jail free with, their green messaging, right?
You mentioned earlier about the simple volume of carbon that needs to be extracted to be on any course to controlling the amount of carbon contribution that we're making to the global carbon budget. And I wanted to talk about the carbon removal XPRIZE. A few people watching this conversation won't have heard of that, so if you can give a bit of an introduction and then talk about Seafield's success so far in that process. Yeah,
so a couple of years ago, not long after Seafields was formed, actually not long after we'd kind of given ourselves our own sort of North Star vision of getting to a gigaton of carbon removal, so a gigaton being 1 billion tons of CO2. Elon Musk announced that he was going to put 100 million from the Musk Foundation into the carbon removal XPRIZE. Most people are familiar with the XPRIZE, but the general concept is very large pots of money going into innovation to really accelerate that innovation, and then they bring investors and foundations and donors in to fund the prize in the first place. So the carbon removal XPRIZE had to focus on technology-enabled or purely technical solutions for carbon removal. We fall into the former camp, so we're a technology-enabled, nature-based solution. And there was an initial phase where they took on a milestone prize, or they gave a milestone prize and a student prize to X number of competitors. We passed as a qualifying company, despite being, pretty much just an idea at the time. Now that's then sort of evolved to the grand prize. So finalists had to submit quite recently their application, or people that desire to be a finalist, and they're going to select the final 20 very soon. Out of those 20, they need to be on a pathway to remove 1,000 tons of CO2 this year. And that's really accelerated, I think, it's accelerated the market. It set a timescale on companies removing 1,000 tons of CO2. And so, a lot of companies are going to probably be able to get to that by February 2025.
So the clock started ticking in January 2024, February 2024, so correct. Last month.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier about the volume of sargassum that's naturally proliferating. We'll get that word in the end. That plays into some of your modelling, doesn't it? You're kind of reliant a little bit on the amount of seaweed that you need in order to extract all this carbon.
Yeah. So I think if you bring it back to the Caribbean and our kind of immediate short-term plans, we're going to go after the XPRIZE, not because we kind of had these big grand visions of winning it. It's going to be very, very competitive, and seaweed biomass sinking is lagging behind a little bit because it doesn't have some of the benefits of some of the research that's happened in other areas that's provided more certainty. So there's a slim chance of us winning it, but we are going to go for it because we see the market has been accelerated as a result of it. And if we aren't removing carbon by this year, then we will be left behind. And so all of this invasive sargassum in the Caribbean, at the moment, out of that 60 million tons, probably only about 500,000 of it is actually beaching. But when it beaches, it's really quite catastrophic. And it can be as high as a person on a beach. I mean, it's crazy how much can come in. And it comes in within the course of a few hours. So at the moment, when it starts to rot, and you only get 12 hours from when it beaches to process it before it becomes unusable for all of these products that we kind of briefly touched on today. So it's hugely valuable, yet you can't create that value because unless you you spend $1 trillion building barriers across the entire Caribbean ready to catch it, you don't know where it's going to land, and it uses so much energy to go out and pick it up. So, our first step this year will be to go to places like Mexico, Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where we've been operating, and our partners have been operating, work with existing infrastructure that's already out there, pick up what sargassum is just not being used, and help them to process it. Typically, that sargassum would have otherwise gone into landfill, or even worse, it would have been burnt. Or in some countries, they are sinking it, but they're sinking it to quite low depths, and they're not monitoring what's happening with it. So we're working with the government of Barbados to run trials within their exclusive economic zone, where we will bail up some of this sargassum, sink it to 2,000 meters, 4,000 meters, monitor it over the next 18 months, using the James Cook and the National Oceanography Centre as a partner, to know how safe it is to then sink it. And if the results of that over these 18 months are positive, then every country across the Caribbean can use this as a method to, one, resolve their invasive sargassum, two, contribute either towards their national determined contributions for carbon removal, or carbon balancing, should we say, or sell the credits on the voluntary carbon market with our help. So it's it's subverting what is a massive, massive problem, cost them potentially about $1,500 to $2,000 per ton to deal with, to flip it so that they can actually extract probably $1,500 to $2,000 of value rather than having it as a waste product. So that's kind of our immediate first step. We can actually get to about 100 megatons of carbon removal just in the Caribbean alone. That's the surface area of Trinidad, to put it into perspective. So not a relative dot in the size of the Caribbean alone. And in parallel, then we'll start to look at the open ocean and building of the subtropical jars.
And since you've been running Seafield, have you seen a change in perception towards Seafield carbon extraction? Have you seen a lot of other businesses come into this space, or do you still feel like a relative lone wolf?
I think the good thing about the ocean is that it's an incredibly diffuse environment, and it's away from a lot of human ecosystem and human eyes. And that's also a bad thing, because then it feels like a very alien environment, and there's a lot of criticism that, well, is what you're doing just brushing your dirt under the carpet and thinking, well, out of sight, out of mind. Yeah. And of course, that's just not true. And there was also a lack of awareness about the fact that this is going to happen anyway, because the ocean is just going to grow more biomass as a result of global warming. It's just what happens. So I think whether we've seen a big step change, think back to COP in Dubai last year, there wasn't a lot of money flowing to the space. There was a lot of people in COP in Egypt saying, we need to get money into the promising startups, so we need to put money into MCDR, marine carbon dioxide removal. In Dubai, a year later, everyone's announcing funds to put money into MCDR. Everyone's talking about how blue carbon is probably the answer. And there's been that step change in perception. There's still a lot of people that kind of harvest fears and about us messing with the system, but they just don't realize how broken that system is already as a result of human intervention. So as we're finding microplastics at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, we're bleaching our corals. They're virtually all dead now, and there's kind of no coming back unless we start taking this carbon out of the water very quickly. And the oceans are becoming more stratified as a result of changing temperatures, and they will become more so they'll become even less productive. So we'll stop being a carbon sink eventually, the ocean, it will start off-gassing instead. So these are, but people don't know that. So there's been documentaries. We did a documentary that was on Bloomberg Originals recently with Nikolai Coster-Waldau, who was best known as Jaime Lannister. He from Game of Thrones, so he came out, visited our farm at St. Vincent. And so there's so much more information coming out that the policymakers general public and many academics are now learning much more about these problems, and so are getting slowly on side. Always some naysayers and people that are trying to maintain the status quo, but for the most part, that step change has been, and it's a paradigm shift that we're seeing.
John, this has been amazing. I've got a final question, and we ask everyone. The concept of this video series is connecting different industries, different parts of the same industry. And if you were able to connect us with someone to bring onto this sofa here and have this same conversation, who would you bring?
So I would recommend Will Pearson. So he's the founder of Ocean Bottle. So we talked about this problem, these plastic islands in the middle of our gyres. So he has an incredibly clever business model to help tackle that. So he finds ways of getting financing into ocean cleanup type projects and river cleanup projects, leveraging corporates and their big budgets to kind of solve these problems. Some of it manifests in bottles. So he has the Ocean Bottle, right, which is one product, which Seafield did a partnership with, a campaign with them. But also they do these big campaigns that are worth sort of millions, and they've done over 1 billion kilograms of plastic removal from the oceans already. So he's a really good guy. You should chat to him.
Amazing. Well, thanks again for your time. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.